maybe good evening to some people. Welcome to our Talent Collective webinar. I am Natalie, one of the co-founders of Talent Collective. We're a global community for women in talent acquisition. And we are here today with our last webinar of the year. I can't believe it. Basically, we're only working for 2 more weeks. Nobody's really working 2 weeks from now, right? I don't know. It's basically the end of the year at this point. But we are excited to partner today with Ashby. This topic is made possible by our partners at Ashby, and we are going to be talking about choosing the right TA tech vendors. We all have tech vendors, unless you're a super small early stage startup and you're joining an organization that does not have one yet. But we wanted to put together a kind of best practices guide for TA leaders, or if you're, an individual contributor that aspires to one day be a leader. We wanted to engage in a conversation about what some of the best practices might be. As it's the end of the year, you might be considering putting in your budgets, if you haven't already, new tools, changing out tools. So this conversation really won't be about any tools in particular, like you should use this for sourcing and this for ATS. This is more about the vetting process and how to decide when you need it, what you need, who you need, and then making those business cases to your stakeholders. So without further ado, I am joined here with 2 of our special guests. And we will just do some quick housekeeping. I wanted to remind everybody that if you have any questions, I will do my best to keep an eye on the chat, but there is a Q&A section on the sidebar. You'll also see that there's a chat section. So if you could please, in the chat, put your location, where are you where are you clicking in from? And your LinkedIn profile. That would be great. We'd love to kind of share that with the group. And then you'll see the Q&A section. That's where you can pose any questions for our speakers, and I will make sure to keep an eye on that and pose those to the group. And then after the fact, we will make the recording available. You'll be able to find it on our Talent Collective YouTube page, and then Ashby will also make it available on their event landing page. You'll get a follow-up email as well. So now, without further ado, I will introduce our 2 guests. First, we have Brandon Wadley. He is 16 years of experience in TA, with hands-on recruiting at Netflix, Facebook, Amazon, and then the other half leading high-performing teams at companies like Tesla, Enjoy Technology, and Gong. And then he pivoted into a career of talent operations consulting. So he partners with startup TA leaders to establish their recruiting foundations, of which this topic is very, very relevant to the work that he does. So without further ado, Brandon, say a quick hello.
Good morning and good afternoon.
Yes.
Good to be here.
He is with Noble Talent. So if you want to find him on LinkedIn, be sure to connect. And then next with us is Melissa Willis. She is the manager of recruiting operations and customer experience at Lime. If you haven't, who hasn't rode a Lime at some point? So you should probably be familiar with the brand, but she's been with Lime for about 3.5 years and handles all things rec ops. She has a very small but mighty team of 2 and is the chair of the company's Veterans ERG group, Employee Resource Group. So prior to that, she was also in the rec ops space within the insurance industry at Esurance, Allstate, Gallagher, and she's been in TA for 10 years and has a little bit of HR as well. So we invited Melissa, obviously being in rec ops, this is also very relevant to her day-to-day function and responsibility. So why are we here today? As I mentioned, the purpose of this webinar will be to discuss those common pain points of tool evaluation. What does that process look like? What are some actionable strategies to make that business case? And then address how to align the stakeholders to get a yes, on the ideal tool that you want, but then also planning for a smooth implementation. So why does this matter? if you implement a misstep in a tool, it can waste resources, time, money, create friction within your TA team and with hiring managers. And even in some cases, I've been guilty of it once. You step into a startup, you evaluate the tools that they have, you say, oh, I don't like this tool, and you switch it. But was it really necessary? Did you really need to do that right then and there, or ever? Maybe it works, maybe it's just a processes type of thing, or a training opportunity. So first, we're going to start with identifying the need for a tool. So I'm going to pose these questions to both Melissa and Brandon, but let's start off with what actually triggers the need for a new vendor or tool. How did either of you identify when was the right time?
I'll go first. So typically in my line of work, so we're helping companies figure out their tech. So we'll often do an assessment at the beginning of any of our engagements where we'll come in, we'll do some fact finding. So we'll interview the recruiters, the coordinators, the stakeholders, and we'll find out what the major pain points are. And that is what helps us inform, where the gaps are. Right. And then from there, we can determine whether this is a process issue, whether it's a systems issue, whether they need a new system, or if it's a configuration thing that, a lot of people will buy a new tool, new ATS, and they'll just open the box and start using it, and it gets really messy. And there's a lot of things like with Greenhouse, with Ashby, where there's tons of customization. And the people who love it are the people who know how to use it and configure it properly. The people that hate it, it got really messy and they can't figure out what the data is telling them, and there becomes a lot of issues downstream. So that's typically how we'll initially gauge. But a lot of our clients will initiate reaching out to us because of their ATS is a pain point, and then they want to switch. So that's where we do the finding to see if they really need to.
Can you give some examples of what are the things on that assessment that you're evaluating for?
I mean, the entire audit, it encompasses everything. So when it comes to the recruiter's experience, the hiring manager's experience, we want to dig into what are the pieces of in your day when it comes to recruiting that really slow you down, that are these hurdles to get to the next step, where we know that there's wasted time and effort and frustrations. So that's typically where we'll find the pain points, but it could, take the shape of creating an offer is really difficult. Where do I go to find the numbers? How many, things do I need to submit? How many approvers are there on this? And then it ends up taking me 2, maybe 3 days from the time I want to offer to the time I actually can extend an offer. That's an issue, right? Things like that. But it also could be, the way that they're configuring their system from the on-site or the recruiter screen to the hiring manager screen to the on-site. There might be some drop off within those stages where you can identify within the pipeline where those funnel drops are.
Yeah. And those are great because that's an overall kind of evaluation of the recruiting operation function as a whole and holistically. And that ties in then to the trickle down of the tool itself. Even things that are, have your hiring managers been trained on the tool? Are they actually excited and engaged to use it? How much training did your recruiters get? Are they just using it out of the box like yourself, or did they actually get to go in there and learn about all the key functions? I feel like it often is sometimes just easier, okay, I'm gonna throw it out the window and blank canvas, I just want to start over. And for me, that pain point when I was head of talent was usually around data. All this data is already in here and there's no way to just get it better. So let's just dump this thing and start over, or even factory reset this whole system. But that obviously isn't the best course of action. So Melissa, what about you? I know you're in the process of kind of doing this such process, evaluating the tool. So anything you'd like to share?
Yeah, for us, what was really important in deciding if we needed a new tool was really looking holistically internally, right? So I'm internal at an organization and really looking to see where the team is at in terms of working towards meeting the company's objectives. So are we able to meet the company's objectives from X, Y, and Z? And are we able to do it in a manner that is efficient and scalable? So for us, it was really digging into that, digging into the system, very similar to what Brandon did, doing an audit, speaking with all of the correct stakeholders that are end users, and understanding where the pain points were, the bottlenecks, and making sure that we identified ways to improve them, either through optimization or thinking about a new tool.
Got it. Yeah, that's super helpful. And we'll talk a little bit more about stakeholders and making a business case coming up here soon. But really the key reflection here is it really the tool or how it's configured, or is it external factors like team growth or shifting priorities or functionality or training? So that's really the first take home that we want to really stick with everybody in the audience is it's not necessarily tool specific, but it can in fact be process driven. So make sure you're really considering both and thinking about both. And I'm just keeping an eye on the Q&A section. I don't see any questions yet, but if you have any, feel free to drop them in the Q&A and whoa, there's a lot of people in here. Lots of LinkedIn profiles. Let's see. I want to make sure I don't miss any questions. Okay, moving on. So we're now going to talk about actually building that business case. So let's first start with who do you actually need to make a business case to, right? Is it finance? Is it your C-suite? Is it your team, right? Are you considering them in that process? So I won't speak for either one of you, but I am curious about who you've involved in that process and making sure that you had the right business case for all those different stakeholders.
Yeah, so I'll go ahead and start this one. For me, what was really important was, first of all, involving my team, not necessarily in building the business case itself, but again, understanding their pain points to help me put together a business case that would ultimately be handed off to the head of recruiting. In that build of the business case, I really focused on outlining things that the head of recruiting would need to know, such as putting together like a document of the different stages of the process and where the bottlenecks were within each stage. Then I would focus on what was needed from a finance perspective. While I was not the person going to the finance team, I wanted to make sure that my head of recruiting had what they needed to go to the finance team successfully. So that included a cost analysis, a detailed breakdown of all the costs associated with the product of interest, an ROI detail. So a detailed breakdown of how the tool will save money in the long run and increase efficiency. So not just thinking about dollars, but dollars in the figure of dollars, but also dollars in the manner of time. So efficiency gains are very important and something that my finance team wanted to better understand. And then we also focused on what our senior leadership team really wants. So I focused on building into my business case how the tool will help increase alignment, again, with the company goals. So we really focused on ensuring that we were improving our compliance capabilities, reducing risk as we're currently going through the IPO readiness process, and what will help us be successful after we go IPO. Plus the need to have better reporting capabilities. That's something that we were really lacking, and the senior leadership team was constantly asking for that. So really focusing on implementing or integrating that information into the business case that was then handed off to the head of recruiting to present to senior leadership.
That's amazing. Thank you. Brandon, anything to add?
I mean, that was really well said, Melissa. You covered it all. So I think I guess the biggest piece is here, like there are going to be delineations on what's important to which stakeholder. So, finance is going to care about something different than your head of people. The CEO, might have some special thing that they're hanging on to for the culture, within the recruiting. So just making sure that you're anticipating those needs and answering those questions. But I'd say Melissa was really thorough in that.
The thing that stood out to me was really tying the business case to whether you use the word OKRs or KPIs, like whatever those goals are, company-wide, department level, and maybe, I don't know if you go as far as like the individuals themselves, but really looking at, okay, what are those goals and initiatives for the next year, and then tying that back, how it will help gain efficiency. And Melissa, you shared a couple, which were really cool, but I'm just curious, for anyone in the audience that maybe hasn't been a TA leader yet or hasn't gone through this type of experience, are there certain KPIs that people should consider when they're in this type of role, that they could tie back to an ATS? I mean, naturally reporting, right? Compliance was a good one, but I'm just curious if there's any others that maybe you didn't mention.
So some of the super granular metrics that I added into that for my head of recruiting was offer acceptance rates, but tying that to the candidate and hiring manager net promoter score to understand the experience and taking in some of the qualitative data from those surveys. We have a big push on the channel mix, right? So where are our sources of hires coming from? We want to better understand that to make sure that we're getting the best bang for our buck out of the tools that we're paying for. And then while I'm not 100% in love with these metrics, we also focused on time to metrics. So time to hire, time to fill, and what does that look like? So those were some of the granular metrics that we focused on. Brandon, what about you? High level metrics that you could think of?
Yeah, some of the pieces that are really important is knowing like what your team capacity is, building in some buffer for that as well, so that you're not running red line constantly, or if something happens where somebody's out sick, somebody leaves, that you're still in a good state to be able to ramp a little bit. But I would say in evaluating, like I was saying, like something that the head of finance might care about is like the bottom line, right? So you're trying to compare like our current tool versus this new tool, but what is that going to be if you add in the time savings, right? So you have to build those types of things in, so it's not just here's what we have now, here's what we want, and there's an increase of 10K, right? Which in the grand scheme, 10K is not that big, but if you're migrating from a tool that is like a earlier stage ATS to like an enterprise one, there might be a lot of integrations that you're going to add on that could be, starting at 25,000 and then it's going to be 60,000 once you're done with your whole tech stack, right? So thinking ahead about those types of things that you're going to it's going to be an all-in-one solution like an Ashby, or if you're going to have to integrate with other solutions that might add up. But I'd say like once you have all the data points, it's turning that into a story that makes sense and like matters to them. So I'll just say another example of that would be for, let's say the engineering team, like they have this process where they want to have like 5 engineers interview one person. If you were to chalk that up into like actual time and then salaries, like if you could get the engineering time back, that head of engineering is probably going to look at the how long is it taking to hire somebody, how many interviews do we need to conduct to get there, and then how much is that costing. But from a finance perspective, they're going to be looking at the bottom line, so translating that into like time equals money and like average salaries, here's what we're wasting in time now. And that's not necessarily a system thing, that's a process change in that case. But you do the same thing when you're thinking about like, what systems could save us money, if it's an automated sourcing platform, if it's an automated scheduling platform, if it's, something that's like a data reporting and you're ending up spending 5 hours on your Friday to compile all the data, that adds up. And I know probably a lot of people, at least, like talent leaders that are responsible for those things, rec ops people that are responsible for those things, Data at your, like, in your hand is so valuable. But if you have to go and sift through spreadsheets and compile all these things together and then build it yourself, which I see Melissa nodding her head because we've talked about that at length. Those are things that add up, and if your system is not adequate for that, it that can be a real big pain point.
Mm-hmm. That was amazing. I love that one. Also, when you referenced capacity planning, I thought about the headcount planning part, right? Let's say your company is at a stage where they want to double in size next year, or maybe you work for a larger organization and they have big hiring goals. Going through that capacity planning process, not just for how many recruiters, like people that you need, but also, do your tools currently support your ability to meet that capacity, right? Is it going to support the people you currently have in their workload? And or, not that we're trying to get rid of any recruiters' jobs here, but could there be more efficiencies brought onto or provided to recruiters where then it could level up some people to be in more strategic or creative types of positions? So in reference to capacity, I think about people, process, and tools. So that was a great one there. Okay, so the key thing here, building a business case, is you obviously are going to have different stakeholders. Some of those, obviously the standout ones will be finance, your most senior leadership, rec ops. We talked a little bit about how to approach them uniquely different based on their persona. But are there any recommendations on like different talk tracks, right? Would you approach the conversation differently versus like what you're actually handing over and what you need to prepare? Are those conversations uniquely different? And I understand maybe based on your positions, you don't get an opportunity to have those conversations, but has there ever been a situation where, Melissa, maybe your CPO said, I need this, this, and this because I'm going to be presenting it this way? I'm just curious. You may not have an answer to this one, but I was just thinking about, okay, it's one thing to prepare the material, but then how do I actually present it to the persona that I'm in front of?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and something that I had to go through when I was evaluating a different tool. So when I was going to present to the CPO and the senior leadership team within HR, I had to put together a high level deck, right? Because you want to make it a story and not so granular when speaking to that level of an audience, and really outlining some of the things that Brandon talked about in terms of, if we're doing this manually, this is the time that we're spending doing it. This is how much money we're spending from a salary perspective. And then really breaking it down into chunks where they could understand, like, if we implemented this, we'll see a reduction in manual work, increase in automation, which will then allow different shifts in terms of the workload for different people. And as you mentioned, moving them into more strategic roles. And it's about the story that you tell them at a high level, making sure that they understand it. Mm-hmm. So that's some of the work that I did when speaking to that audience. But I've also spoken with multiple other audiences, including, when I was going through another process, I was speaking with my IT team, right? So what did they need to know? I really focused on informing them first and foremost what we needed, and then getting them the documentation that they needed to better understand if the tool can sit in our ecosystem. So making sure that I was presenting to them in the correct way. Doing the same thing when speaking with legal, thinking about compliance, the contracts. So making sure that I was getting to them what they needed to know from an MSA, a DPA, regulatory perspective. So those are some of the things that I was focused on from a communications perspective.
Mm-hmm. Super helpful, because you don't often think about, the IT team or legal, but those are personas that come into play for sure. Brandon, anything to add there?
Those are all the main things. I guess from a story or like talk track perspective with the leadership team. I mean, obviously you've got your recruiting leader and then you've got your like executive team. The things that they're going to care about is, are we going to hire the best people quicker, right? It's like an efficiency piece and a reliability piece. So if you can prove that, I'm sure they'll be happy. They'll just, say approved, and send it up for approval with finance. But, finance is going to probably get into the details and really scrutinize, the tools. And it's kind of funny to me where like companies will scrutinize their tools budget, but they'll be a little more lenient on headcount. I'm sure that's not everywhere, but I've seen that at multiple places where they'll try to squeeze the tools budget as much as possible. But there could be a ton of efficiencies gained by a tool. And if you can prove that tool is going to gain, like a time efficiency, an output efficiency, a reliability, without increasing headcount, then that, saves the company money. So if you're able to put that case in front of them and prove that like this will actually speed us up without adding headcount, that's a savings, right? And it should be a no-brainer. I think a lot of us are afraid of finance in a way because it's like, they'll either say yes or no, but they're usually pretty reasonable. If you're able to speak in a way that makes sense to them and they see it, it's like, okay, that makes sense. If we implement this, that gives us more runway. It like expands the capacity of our team without adding a headcount, which that can be pretty expensive. But if it's a tool that costs maybe, $15K, $30K a year, that's a sliver of, like human labor, right? And if it's a coordination tool that helps automate things and speed things up, that's win-win for everybody.
Yeah, definitely talk numbers to them.
Yeah.
They like those numbers.
Yes.
I'm curious if when you said, they're usually more lenient with the headcount budget, but like they're more critical with the tools budget. I wonder, this is just kind of off the cuff, if that's because in tools you often get locked into multi-year contracts versus people, right? Sadly, we can be a little bit more flexible and amenable to scale up, scale down. Sadly, we've seen that several years, but it's a little bit easier to transition a person in and out versus a tool. I'm just kind of throwing it out there. Don't really know, but food for thought. Okay, I'm gonna go to the Q&A. We had a couple of questions that came in. This one goes back to actually assessing the tool. Or assessing if you need a tool, excuse me. Question from Sarah. From your assessment, how do you determine if you need to augment your existing tech stack with an integration versus a complete overhaul? Great question.
That's actually a really good question and something that I went through extensively. So we were really focused on optimizing our current tool. Everybody knows, well, I think everybody knows, getting a brand new ATS is a lot. That's a huge project. So I was really focused on what can we optimize to make our current tool better. So I was looking at optimizing different integrations, scheduling, sourcing, reporting. And what we found was, while we could optimize a few of those things, ultimately we would have to add additional tech on top of our ATS to get us to what we needed. And adding that additional tech was going to increase our tool spend, which, as Brandon said, very much restrictive, considerably. So I went to market and started going through the process of evaluating an ATSs. Ideally looking for all-in-one options that had all of the bells and whistles that we needed built within. So for us, it was really about first checking to see if we could optimize to meet what we needed within a reasonable cost, and then making the decision that, we're not going to be able to get to what we needed without that additional spend, and went the full RFP ATS route.
I'm curious if either of you have gone through the process of actually doing an entire overhaul versus like, okay, we're going to implement here, maybe Brandon with any of your clients, because those are two totally different scenarios. And with more and more all-in-one platforms becoming available, I think we're only going to find it happening more and more. You may not have partnered yet with a client, or maybe Melissa, you haven't done yet, but I was just curious if you've ever gone through that process of like, okay, we have to downsize 4 tools and we're going to bring one, which I imagine is challenging to do away with 4 vendors at one time.
Yeah, we certainly have. We'll typically see companies that are, let's say they're on Lever, for example, and they're struggling with the analytics piece. I've been in that boat a few times. I was speaking about my, Fridays, just trying to compile all the data, put it together for the, weekly report. And, and that made sense to get a tool that helps with that, to help visualize the data. So in that case, using Gem for their Talent Compass product, it makes it really easy, but that's another tool you have to bolt on, which is pretty expensive, and they're pretty cost comparable to your entire ATS. Right. So, that adds up. But when you think about a tool like Ashby that has made the strategic move to build all these pillars into one platform, you think about it's one invoice, that you have to approve. It's not 5, right? And there's, like the ease of getting that approved is a lot easier, and it's not going to get, how can we slim this down? Do we really need all these tools? It's just one. Right. Versus having your like ATS in your LinkedIn, which a lot of times that's like what the essentials, you almost can't get away with it. I mean, now I see a lot of companies that are trying to find alternates to LinkedIn because that's the biggest spend. But it's, finding, like ways to get around that where you don't have to buy multiple tools. But there are definitely times where companies are like the tool is fine, but there's this gap, there's this pain point. What can we use to solve that? And that's a perfectly acceptable way to do it. Like, absolutely. And I'm not saying like Ashby or another tool is better. It's about assessing for the needs for your business, what's going to solve the big problems that you have. And no tool is perfect, right? And like, I think there is this like frustration, throw it out, right? Grass is greener type of thing when it comes to, recruiting tech. And, a lot of times you can get by with just Google Sheets, like a spreadsheet and a phone, right? I've seen companies do it. I've seen companies use Slack as an ATS.
Wow.
It's, it's definitely unconventional. I wouldn't recommend it, but it's doable.
Oh my gosh. Yeah. Not 10 out of 10, but it could be a 5 out of 10 option. Another thing that I think about is, the timing, right? Like, when are you up for renewal with another tool? If there's another 2 years to go, like, well, does it make sense to just augment for the time being? Or if you really, really want to do an overhaul, would your current vendor help pay you out of those other contracts? So some things to consider also, augment versus overhaul, is the timing of if and when you can get out of your current contracts. So, okay. I don't see any other questions in the chat. So if you have a reminder, put it in the Q&A section and we'll be sure to get to those. So moving on. I don't know if this is the fun or not so fun part, but actually evaluating vendors, right? I don't know about you guys. I actually like demos. I don't like all the follow-up sales calls and emails after the fact, which actually is a reason to come to some of Talent Collective's webinars, because we have our partners come on, do their demos, and you're just one amongst many, and you get to check it out and see it, but you're not having to go through a sales process. It was just a side plug there for Talent Collective. But when you're actually ready to start evaluating, what sort of process do you put these vendors through? And when I say vendors, I'm saying it nicely, right? Like your partners in tool technology. I'd love for you guys to to add any context here, do you do formal RFPs, RFIs, whatever they're called now? Something less rigid, something more informal? What do you guys put them through?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I really think that it depends on really what the need is and what you know of the tool or vendor that you're looking to acquire to get help with. So for us, I wanted to explore new background check vendors. And I know obviously some players in the market, but I didn't know them all. So I really focused on outlining the scope of what I needed, put together kind of an outline of everything that I was hoping for, and then partnered with my procurement team to do a formal RFP process.
Mm-hmm.
So I gave them our wish list, for lack of better words, and they went to market. They identified 4 background check vendors that could meet almost all of what we needed. And then we interviewed them. We met with them, asked them all the questions, did all the back and forth. We ultimately decided to stay with our background check vendor, as we found through this process that they were kind of the leader in the market. So again, it really depends on what you know of the tools that you're wanting and what you want to better understand. If you want to do formal or informal, that's the approach that we took.
Yeah, I love that. Like, put together a form, have them fill it out. And you mentioned kind of wish lists versus needs. Were there any like specific questions that you needed answered, maybe around like compliance or things that are unrelated to your desires for the tool? Anything that was like they must meet these requirements type of questions?
Yeah, definitely. For us, it was, could they integrate with our ATS? Not just from a US perspective, but Lime is extremely global. So we needed to find a vendor that was able to integrate with our ETS for both national or international and domestic background checks. That was really, really important. We wanted to make sure that they were compliant in all countries, that they were having candidates sign authorization forms and following the law of the process for background checks. So that was something that we made sure to ask each vendor. And then just the little nuances here and there for background checks, but those were the 2 biggest things for us because we were previously on 2 different background check vendors. And as Brendan mentioned, 2 invoices and lots of auditing of those. So those were some of the questions that we focused on.
That's great. I'd love to see your template if you're willing to share it.
Yeah, definitely.
To spread it around. Brandon, anything to add?
Yeah. I mean, that's the first step is knowing what you need. And I would put this in the context, run it similar to a search, like a candidate search. So doing it in a structured way, really assessing what are the objectives that you're trying to achieve here. Like obviously those gaps that you've identified, so that you're not just going in blindly and seeing who's the best salesperson or who's got the coolest features, and you may have heard something online or like one of your friends said like this one's awesome, and then you're just you're biased already, right? So think about it in the same way you would if you were recruiting, but just standardize it before you go out to start talking to the vendors. Just like truly, like if there were no names of ATSs or whatever the tool is, what is it that we're trying to achieve? What are the questions we need to have answered in order to know whether this is a yes or a no? And then go from there. And typically, to kind of touch on the RFP, like I feel like RFP is, an older thing, or like for very large companies, right? Where that's mandatory. We need to have everything documented. Typically in, more startup culture, you're going to build your own RFP, like your wish list, like the must-haves, the nice-to-haves, and then start talking to people. But typically, you don't want to just like take a bunch, like every vendor that's out there and just start demoing, right? Like that's costly in terms of time. And there might be some that you're just like, they don't meet the list anyway. So let's not waste their time or ours. But just, obviously doing your own research, whether that's just a quick, internet search, seeing, like check out G2 for like reviews and things like that. But I would say leverage your like peer networks. Like Talent Collective is a great one. Like Ashby's got their own like rec ops. And there's several other like growth by design. It's just where, talent leaders, rec ops leaders are there. Ask the question. They all have like, online forums. Maybe it's a Slack group, something like that. But that's actually where Melissa and I crossed paths a while ago at this point. And she just asked a simple question, because she was having, there was a pain point with her current system and people were chiming in. And then I was like, hey, if you want to just talk, if you're considering new platforms, let's talk through it. I've used most of the prominent ones.
Mm-hmm.
I can give you at least a high level, like this is where they excel, this is where they're deficient. If this is your pain point, I wouldn't recommend this one.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So you can at least filter it down. And then you leveraging those, like you'll probably find someone in those groups that is living with that tool, and it's not, like a reference from the vendor. It's just unsolicited, like, hey, well, solicited by you directly. I'm considering going with this tool. Has anyone used it before and would be open to a reference? And I'm sure like either way, if they're like a raving fan or if they absolutely hate it, they'll let you know. Right.
Mhm.
And that can be really valuable data, but keeping it in context to their business. So it's not like if it's a scathing review, dig a little bit deeper, just like you would do a backdoor reference in recruiting. Let's keep your eyes open about it. Like, really like what are our goals? Is this going to fit that? Right.
Mm-hmm.
So, oh yes, I like Shannon's Reddit. Definitely a great place. You can see threads and people will, chime in and, it's pretty useful. So that's another one that I would say. And then once you have that list, just doing demos, like I'll typically narrow it down to 2 vendors, maybe a third, but you probably don't need to do more than that.
Mm-hmm. The power of community and back channeling, huh?
Yeah.
I can't tell you how many times in our community member platform, people post and they're like, I'm in the process of evaluating XYZ type of tool. Who's everybody using? It's like, and you see, maybe top 2, 3 recurring names in there. So instantly they just whittle down a whole list down to maybe the 2 or 3 that they should be spending time on. It happens weekly in our community, whether it's a sourcing tool or an ATS or an interview scheduling tool. Really is the power of community, whether it's a Slack group or a membership-based community or whatnot. The other thing that I've seen is when you're doing this back channeling or soliciting the questions in these community forums, is asking if anybody's willing to do their demo with you, like show their actual instance with like real data, how they're using the functionality. So it's not a demo of some like random, stuff that they've put in there, but it's really like, how is Lime using this tool today? We've had a lot of members say, sure, like let's book a call. I'll show you my tool. Let me know what your pain points are. I can show you if or how it might solve for that. So thank you for bringing that up, Brandon. The other thing that I always like to preface to our community members is not take the feedback with a grain of salt, but like really consider, people might be putting their top tools in there because they just love them. But obviously, right? They love them, they're recommending them, they're brand ambassadors for them, but will that tool actually be right for your size or stage of company, for how you hire, where you need to hire, what your budget is? So while you may love, an Ashby tool, it may not be the right size or scale for you yet. So take that into consideration. We do, of course, love Ashby, but there are tools that are intentionally meant to be for certain sizes and stages of companies. So that's one other thing to think about when you're evaluating. So we actually have quite a few questions in the chat. So I will show you in the Q&A section. So I'm going to pose these. let's see. There was one in here. Okay, when you're doing the assessment and business case, building that business case, how long does that actually take? Like, is that a quarter? Is it a month? Is it half a year? Um, and maybe Melissa, you can answer this question. And how would you do it without the support of like an actual rec ops person or a team?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and I'm laughing inside because I got it done in a couple of days, or to what I thought was done. And then I leveraged one of my talent advisors, trusted confidants, and they were like, okay, you need to add more user stories. You need to explain the risks. You need to explain the dependencies. So those were some of the things that I didn't quite think about at a granular level. So after the back and forth collectively, I would say that the document was done within 2 weeks. But it's really important to think about every single thing that you need to add on there, such as the executive summary, the business problem, your objectives, like what are you looking to get, the risks, the dependencies, the success metrics. So it really depends on again what you know ahead of the time, and then kind of digging in and adding more things as you start meeting with vendors. So we kind of did the process a bit choppy. So I put together a business case, missed a few things, met with vendors, did some demos, and said, "Oh, they can do this. Let me add this. This is what we need. We need this as well." And then just kind of went back and forth with my trusted confidant internally to make sure that the document was 100% buttoned up.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's definitely an iterative process. Brandon, anything there?
Melissa, I want an intro to your confidant.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'd say to address the question on timing, like how long does it take, and especially if you don't have a rec ops person, I'd say, I mean, it doesn't take that much time in terms, like if you were to just dedicate solely to that, drop everything that you have on your plate. But we all know in recruiting that is not likely possible with everything that you have going on. So I would just make sure you keep that in mind. Like if it's a busy season, if you have a full rec load, if you have, things coming down the pipe, you probably want to allocate more time. But if you have like a rec ops person that you're like, I want you to just dedicate to this, you have, a month, right? That's probably way more time if they're just dedicating to it, right? Like Melissa said, like if it's drop everything, we can just do this quickly. It might take a week, maybe 2 weeks, but I would allocate with what you have going on. You're probably gonna, pepper in some research, and then the next week, you're gonna build out your to-do list or your priorities, and then the next week you're gonna start scheduling calls with the vendors, and then you're gonna evaluate, and then you're gonna finally have like a pretty good direction of which way you're gonna head. But then you're gonna have to sell it, right, to the internal stakeholders. So your business better than I do. So, sometimes those things are like, cool, looks like you thought of everything, approved. Other times it takes months and many conversations, and it's really frustrating. So sorry for there is no clear answer, one size fits all, but just keeping those considerations in mind and buffering for more time than you think, because there's always going to be something that pops up you didn't anticipate.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Right.
Great. Oh, go ahead, Melissa.
I was just going to say that's really just putting the document together, right? So I would say I started the process in April and we finalized it last week. So the document was done, but there was so much in between, and we had to align with like our current vendor's end date. So we had to really talk about this at length for multiple months. But the actual putting together of the business case document, as Brandon said, incorporate what you have on your plate today and think about that.
And I know we'll touch on implementation here as well, but just thinking about like where you're at, like you probably know whether you want to keep that tool or not. And there's certainly the things to flesh out that we talked about earlier, is like, is it a configuration thing or not? But plan way in advance. Thinking about the next year, like what tool switches do we want to, things that we may want to introduce, maybe want to swap out, because you also have your contract dates to consider. And, it often happens, like you don't get the reminder from your current vendor until like a month out. And they're like, hey, just want to get your signature on the renewal, because they know that that's too short of a timeline for you to abandon them unless you already have things in flight, right? And it typically takes, the implementation itself several months. So you'll want to have, some overlap time for integration and, transfer over. But those internal conversations can take a while. Like I've had some of our clients had like a 9-month implementation, and that was, they were already thinking about it a year in advance of their last year of contract, right? That they knew they wanted to switch over, but they know it's going to take a long time to get all the business pieces together that were signed. We have an official go date, the training plan, all those things. So we'll just try to be as realistic as possible in the time that it may take you at your company.
Mm-hmm. That's great. I'm going to speed up here because we only have 7 minutes and we have a couple more questions. I actually just did a poll because we probably aren't going to have time to get to implementation, but I'm curious if anybody would want that to be an entire separate session. We can definitely make that happen. So fill out the poll. There was a couple questions about AI. So how are TA teams evaluating tools that have AI as part of components? For compliance, vetting tends to be different than other tools. So any insight here?
I can jump in. And Brittany, I saw your question. Definitely wanted to make sure we touch on this. It's a lot of times it's the company itself and their risk tolerance. Some companies are like very forward with AI and they're like, go for it and we'll take the risk, right? Because there are certainly some risks of, like laws changing. You've signed an agreement and then laws change and you can't use that tool anymore. Like that's possible. But I'd say making sure you do your upfront vetting, but like ask early and like, here's what we're thinking in terms of this tool. If it's like an AI sourcing tool, if it's an AI like transcription tool that helps like record interviews and like gives you the feedback, right? It's like, what are the risk tolerances of another third party having that data? And some companies, if they have the compliance, it's SOX compliance or, whatever it may be that lines up with your company's internal security protocols, then they're probably fine with it, right? It's usually just like, the breach of that, but obviously you don't want to get into like lawsuits of discrimination, right? That could be, I've talked to some heads of talent and their company won't touch AI. Like, they bought Ashby, but they cannot turn on the AI functionality. And it's pretty frustrating for them, right? They're like, I need that, right? Wow. We just don't have the internal capacity to go through all the resumes, and we have the ability to flick the switch, but my company won't let me, right? Mm-hmm. So, those are real considerations. So it's definitely a valid question, but obviously, like some companies are more risk tolerant than others, and just making sure you're not spending a ton of time vetting a product and then getting there at the finish line. It's just enroll those people early. So it's like, hey, considering this, can you join this demo and like ask the questions you need to ask to know if this is viable or not.
And ask the vendor for their compliance documentation. How are they complying with the different laws? With Lyme being so global, I needed to better understand that from a variety of different countries. Some vendors were able to provide that, while the newbies into the market weren't. So that helped us to solidify who we would want to continue with.
That's great. Thank you. Last question. All in one. What does it mean? What do you consider? How do you define it? An all-in-one platform.
Yeah. I would look at it as like your ATS. It has like a base module where you have candidates that apply, you can post jobs, you get approvals, things like that. Like that's the main functions of your ATS. Where we're talking about an all-in-one solution. It's all the things that you would likely bolt on after if that's all you had. So thinking about automated scheduling or automation flows, from a scheduling standpoint, a sourcing platform that can do drip campaigns and find you email addresses, a data visualization platform as well. Like those things that you would typically buy as standalone products, or it also might be like a BrightHire or MetaView, something like that, where it's like an add-on to the system. But if your ATS comes with all of those modules, that's what we mean by all-in-one.
And for me, from an all-in-one perspective, on top of what Brandon said, ideally, we would like the system in finance to feed to the system in HRIS, which would then feed into this ATS, and then bidirectionally feed back from the ATS once you're hired into funneling the candidate into the HRIS. So while it's adding on top of or including on top of the ATS, the in the middle needs, scheduling, sourcing, reporting, it's the end-to-end, front end to back end.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the ability to have the tool support you in the full cycle of recruiting. One thing I will add here is if you're evaluating AI sourcing tools, be sure to ask, is it bidirectional, right? Like, does the AI source externally and from where? And then can it also source from within your system? Because I have seen some tools that only do the external and some that only do it within your system existing candidate pool. So food for that there. Thank you everybody for joining. Thank you, Brandon, Melissa. This is so insightful. I hope everybody found it informative. Do the poll really quickly if you'd like to have an implementation session. We'd love to bring them back. But be sure to check out Talent Collective, check out Ashby, check out Line, check out Noble Talent, check us all out. And then you will get a follow-up with the video, or you can find it on Talent Collective's YouTube. Thank you, everybody. Enjoy your week.
Thank you.
Thank you.